Hello and welcome to today's Partner Academy Live webcast. This is Refactoring Legacy Code Bases. Joining us today we have developer, speaker, and technical evangelist for JetBrains, Hadi Hariri. And now, without any further delay, it is my pleasure to hand you over to your presenter. Hadi, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Dawn. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today and this webinar on refactoring legacy code bases with ReSharper. We have about an hour or just under an hour, 55 minutes. So as Dawn said, the layout of this presentation is going to be about maybe around 5 or 6 minutes of me blabbering at the beginning to give you some background and how the format of the presentation will be. And then I'd like to spend pretty much most of the time showing you some code in Visual Studio. I'll try, because webinars are a little bit hard, but I'll try and keep an eye on the questions and answers once in a while and answer them as we go along if they pile up a lot. If not, I'll try and leave a few minutes at the end to follow up with those questions. If for some reason I manage not to go through all the questions, then please feel free to get in touch with me, and I'll be more than happy to follow up later on in email. I'll give you my details at the end, but just in case you need them, my name is Hadi, spelled H-A-D-I, and you can reach me on email, hadi@jetbrains.com, or on Twitter, Hariri. Okay, so let's get started. So this is apart from being the Windows desktop background, it is what you would know as a Greenfield project, which basically means that you get to work and every day in your life you get to pick and choose the technology and what you want to work on and what code you're going to work on and what project you're going to work on. And it's great. It's fantastic. You get to pick everything. It's like a brand new blue sky and sunny day every day. This is the reality that we're mostly faced on a daily basis, not that Greenfield, but working with either very large legacy systems or code that isn't ours, that, we curse the person that wrote it because obviously they didn't write it the way we wrote it. And what happens is that any Greenfield project basically ends up becoming a legacy project. And now there's different definitions for legacy, but let's just assume that legacy is something that is written already and has some time has passed, and normally it doesn't have any unit testing associated with it, so it's even harder to maintain and work with. And as the code base grows, what happens is that the understanding of that code base starts to decrease if it's not written properly. And impact on changes increases. So every time we touch something, there's a higher chance that we have more impact on bigger parts of the code base. And obviously, we've all experienced a scenario where we change something which is completely unrelated to something else, and suddenly that other thing in some hidden corner that we never thought about breaks. And again, when we don't have unit testing or any kind of regression testing, it becomes harder to discover these things, and we end up shipping code to production that ultimately ends up breaking. And all of this produces an increase in cost. So it's obviously, if it takes us longer to understand, it takes us longer to change the code base, which means the cost for maintaining that code base basically grows. So how does refactoring help here? Because we can take a code base, write it, and never go back and change things, but it's not the right approach. And what refactoring helps us do is clean up the code, which allows us to improve the understanding of the code, because there's nothing better than actually navigating the code base, looking at a code base to try and understand how the code works, how the system works. And refactoring helps us do this. It helps us clean up code smells, get away from bad design decisions, and clean things up, and also move us towards minimizing the impact of change. So as we change things over the years of the project, we start to decouple the system to allow us to minimize that change that occurs when the impact occurs when we change things. Now, what do we refactor, or how do we refactor? Normally, what you do is you look at a code and you you identify what's known as code smells, and you try and get rid of these code smells. You try and make it so that any bad parts of the code aren't really present. And this normally involves a process, which we'll go through in a moment. So by doing this refactoring, what we can do is basically increase the maintainability in effect, that basically it costs us less to maintain it and it's easier to maintain it, and ultimately reducing the cost. Now, coming to this refactoring process, everyone has their different way, but here's a normal scenario that you normally do. Identify code smells. So find those issues that are causing problems, be it for bad design because it's badly coupled, be it because there's just the performance is slow. For many reasons, you can identify code smells. Then perform an impact analysis on these and see exactly when I am going to touch this, if I'm going to refactor it, what exactly is it going to touch? Now, normally what we have is unit tests in order to be able to check that after a refactoring takes place, things continue to work as they should. Unfortunately, and as the abstract said, and as I initially said, a lot of times this isn't the case. We end up with legacy code bases that don't necessarily have unit testing. So we end up in a situation where we have to actually look through the code base to figure out what exactly is it that we're going to touch if we start playing with this area, if we start refactoring this code smell and putting this out. Once we have this, we can, as I said, write a unit test and then try and refactor. Now, unit testing here is a little bit an ambiguous term, because when we talk about unit testing, we're talking about an isolated piece of code which basically all we're testing is one thing. In legacy systems that are tightly coupled, normally that isn't always possible. So there's different patterns to try and make something unit testable. What we can do is, for example, refactor to extract interfaces, to then pass in mock objects or pass in stakes to decouple different parts of a process, to decouple different classes. But again, that isn't always possible. And again, there's multiple ways to solve that. One of them is using frameworks that allow us to isolate things that aren't bound to interfaces or abstract classes. And another way is just to write an integration test. And often people say to me, well, you know, I can't write a unit test because it's too hard. But that's fine. But you know what? Having an integration test is actually better than having no test. So sometimes when push comes to shove, it's fine to write an integration test before doing the refactoring. So our process in this webinar, what I want to focus on is, I'm going to assume that you're familiar with the concept of refactoring. I'm going to assume that you've no doubt read books on refactoring, whether it's Martin Fowler's or a very good book on refactoring, or Michael Feathers, which is dealing with legacy code. And you're familiar kind of with the patterns of refactoring and how to do things and what code smells, etc. are. In this webinar, what I'm going to focus on is help identify those code smells, help identify how to do an impact analysis of a change, and how to refactor the code, and all of this using ReSharper. So if you want to think of the layout of this webinar, we're going to first have a kind of a group of demos or walkthroughs where I'm going to show you how to do inspections to identify code smell and identify issues using ReSharper. And then we'll see how to help refactor using ReSharper. And we'll also do the impact analysis, because unfortunately, as much as I would want to, in real life, I mean, to the extent possible, I always try and write a unit test before refactoring something. But in 40 minutes now that we have, 45 minutes, it's not viable for me to be writing unit tests for every refactoring that I'm going to show you. So for the sake of argument, let's pretend that we will be writing unit tests with these examples. Okay. Now, one more thing to mention or ask before we continue is, I would like to know how many of you are actually using ReSharper today and how many of you are not using it. So if you can just quickly click on that vote button, and it will give me a general idea of the numbers. Okay, so that's a fair amount of you. Around 80% of you are using ReSharper, which is great. So I'm hoping, having said that there's 80 of you that you can find new things, that you'll pick up new things in this webinar. So with that, let's dive in. Let me just switch over. I'm going to share my desktop. Over here. Okay. So you all should be seeing my desktop right now. I'm hoping you do. Dawn, I'm hoping also that if there is some issue or something, you could please interrupt me and let me know about it. So I've got a couple of solutions today that I'm going to walk through. I'm not picking on a specific project. I often go to CodePlex or go to GitHub and pick certain projects which are normally large, which allow me to show some of the features of ReSharper when I'm doing refactoring or analysis. So it's not something specific that I'm picking on when I'm showing a specific project. Here I'm using two. One of them I've created as sample for refactoring, which will open later on. And the other one, the first one that we're starting with, is this project over here, which is basically an ERP store. And I got the code off of CodePlex. I have not really touched anything from that code. And we're just going to go through this and show you some things. Now, if you're not familiar with ReSharper, basically, as I said, the first step is to kind of identify code smell. So ReSharper itself has the ability to look for issues in your solution. I mean, if I click on ReSharper Inspect Code Issues in Solution or in Current Project, what that's going to do is basically analyze my solution and come up with a series of issues. Now, these issues, which I can come out here and show you, are kind of grouped by practices, warnings, constraints, redundancies in code, compiler errors, etc. And each of these kind of identify specific issues, right? So not necessarily does this mean that everything that is here is a code smell. I mean, here it says, for instance, field can be made read-only. Now, we might say, well, a code base is bad because that field is not read-only. Not necessarily. It's that sometimes some suggestions or improvements are more a matter of taste and style than of indicating a potential problem. However, there are issues, for instance, that could cause potential issues in code, like, for example, potential code quality issues where you have, for instance, class catalog service is never instantiated, which in fact, in this case, is not an issue either, but I can get to that a little bit later on. So ReSharper allows you to categorize the different issues of how you can detect problems in your code. And if you go to ReSharper options over here, all of these things that you see, all of these issues here, you can actually configure yourself. So I can see, for instance, common practices and say access to static member of a type by a derived type, and say, well, this is a hint, or do not show, or show it as a suggestion, as a warning, as an error. So this kind of allows me to define my own requirement in what I would consider a code smell or an issue, and then look at the ways in fixing that. Normally, with these suggestions, the refactoring option that you have is basically a quick fix, which ReSharper offers you, which is basically you normally hit the Alt-Enter and then say, okay, fine, I've refactored that, now I've made that field read-only, and now it's going to say to me, well, actually rename it that as well. Now, all of that, again, as I said, is configurable. So you don't need to take this as the ultimate truth of what exactly is a code smell. It's more your own team defines what you consider the style or the issues to be. And these things on the right-hand side basically are highlighting all of those issues, and you can navigate through them and see all of the potential problems. And then, as you saw before, you can navigate the entire solution and find all of the issues in the solution. Now, these are the kind of things that are that come out of the box with ReSharper. But I'm going to show you a couple of other ways to actually do analysis and code smell. Here I have, in fact, a plugin that I wrote, and it's on GitHub. And if I can just, I don't know if you're going to see my browser. You're not going to see my browser, but I'll write the URL here. If you go to http github.com /hariri clean code, you'll be able to see the source code for this plugin that I'm going to show you. Okay, so this plugin over here, you go to ReSharper options. I created a small plugin, which you can see it in the plugins list, which is called Clean Code Plugin. And what this Clean Code Plugin does is add some analysis to ReSharper, extends ReSharper by adding some analysis to kind of detect potential issues in clean code. And I use clean code with permission of Uncle Bob. And this specific one, what it's added is inspection over here, which we'll find it. I think it's in, let me just search for it. There we go, too many dependencies. So what exactly is this? Let me show you this in code. Let me first go to a checkout controller, for instance. Here is a checkout controller in the ASP.NET MVC world. And you can see here that this is basically using a pattern known as dependency injection. And in this pattern, what it's doing is injecting a whole bunch of dependencies that the checkout controller has. Now, you could say this is great because it's decoupling the class, because it's passing in the dependencies, so everything is wonderful. Actually, no, it's not. This is very bad design because what's happening here ultimately is it's creating really tight coupling between the checkout controller and all of these classes. Effectively, what it's doing is that this class is responsible for too many things. So I've taken this concept of having too many dependencies passed into a class and created a plugin for it. And then I can come here and activate that warning and say too many dependencies and show as a warning, for instance. And once I say this, you can see that immediately it shows me that now here it's saying there are too many interfaces being passed into this constructor. You might be violating single responsibility principle. So this is just a sample of what you could do with ReSharper. Basically, if you go to the GitHub page, you can take a look at the source code, and it's very simple. All I'm doing is just using the ReSharper platform to detect the class, find the constructor, see how many dependencies are being passed in, and then just say, well, there's too many. And obviously, that number is configurable under here on the clean code, which is the entry that is created, and I say, yep, set the maximum number of dependencies to 15, which is horrendously bad, and you see that that disappears. But it gives you an idea to where you can extend ReSharper to actually check for issues with your code. Let me show you another example of how we can use ReSharper to detect code smell. So let's go to the catalog controller. And in here, I'm going to go to the member get product list. Okay. And it's one of these. So you can see here that I have if page size is equal to -1, then get page size. Now I'll show you something with this again later on, but what you can also do is select this code, and no doubt that this code that you see there might be repeating itself over and over again throughout your code base. And in this particular case, it's not that important, but I'll show you another case where you can actually refactor this to use a better approach, namely aspect-oriented programming. And you can use ReSharper to detect certain patterns in your code. If I select the code and right-click and say find similar code, what happens is that ReSharper prompts up a pattern dialog, and we'll get into this a little bit more, with placeholders. So it identifies the code. From that code, it creates a placeholder for the different entries. And then I can just say find, and what that will do is find every instance of my code base where that pattern is repeating itself. And again, here it's not a big issue because there's only 2, but I'll show you in the other projects where we can actually use this to our benefit. So to summarize, in analyzing the solution, you can First of all, use the built-in stuff into ReSharper analysis. Second of all, you can look at the extensibility, so like, for instance, the clean code that I've done. And third of all, with patterns, which, again, we'll get into a little bit later on. So assuming that we've kind of detected our code smells and found our code smells, now let's take a look at what tools ReSharper can offer us to perform an impact analysis to see that exactly, well, what happens if I change something? I mean, where is the reach of this code? So saying that, let me go over to a class which is called search term. And obviously you all know the famous, if you don't know, ReSharper has an entry which is find usage. I normally don't use menu entries, but I use them so that you see them here, but I normally use the shortcut key. So if I hit Alt F11, what that's going to do is show me absolutely all of the entries. So this is the minimum that you can do. You should never be searching for text when you're using ReSharper. You can actually search. It understands the semantics of your project. So here I'm searching for an actual class, and I'm saying, where is this being used? And then I can actually group this. So I can say group it by project structure, type and member, etc. And even, in fact, I can even see a preview in the same window, so I don't have to click on each of this. I can just select this, and then it'll show me in place exactly where that code is being used. So this is the basic things in ReSharper in terms of finding usage. There's also the ability to do a find usage as advanced, which allows me to filter out a little bit more the usages. So I can see, okay, I'm going to change this, and in this project, where exactly is it going to affect it instead of the whole solution? Let me just see what happens, you know, if I touch it in this project. And from anywhere, I can always invoke the Navigate To menu. And what that will also allow me to do is see usages of symbol, see the related file, derive symbols, extension methods, reference code, all of these things that somehow influence that code, somehow are connected with that code. So these are basically the kind of basic things that you can do with anything in ReSharper, be it a property, be it a class, be it a namespace, anything. In fact, if you actually click on, for instance, one of the projects, so let me go to a project, let's say ERP Store, CS Proj, and let's select models, for instance. And here, Control-Shift-R, that brings up the refactor menu. What I can do is select Find Code Dependent on Module. So this kind of gives me an idea of the dependencies between the different projects, between the different modules that are in my solution. And while that's if there's any Q&A, so you see, I timed these exactly in terms of speed so that I can have pauses and drink water. Right. So no questions now? Oh, yes, we do. If I can recall the authors of the recommended books about legacy code, yes, Michael, I'll show you that at the end. Okay, so here I am, it's showing me all of the dependencies that, where this module is actually referenced. So you can see that the models, for instance, is referenced by all of these different projects inside the solution. So out of 5 projects in the solution, 4 of them are referencing this model. So this kind of allows me to have an impact analysis on what things I'm going to be touching. Now let me show you some other things that maybe you're not too familiar with ReSharper and impact analysis. Let's go over to the account controller and see here that in the account controller, I'm going to go down to something which I hate, which are regions, and I'll show you how to remove that in a moment. And in the account controller, you can see that I have a property, which is account service. So if you press Control-Shift-Alt-A, and that invokes the inspect this, you see that you have a bunch of menu entries. And let me just show you what these menu entries actually do, because they're very useful. The incoming calls, obviously what that's going to do is show me all of the calls into this controller, into that account service. So you can see that it's showing me all of these calls are coming in, and then, for example, I can go to recover password, and then in recover password, it's going to show me where exactly this is being called from. And notice that when the dialog box was searching, it was also searching in CSHTML because ReSharper is aware of different frameworks and different technologies. So it understands that you might be calling a method from an ASP.NET web form page or Razor page or XAML page, it understands all of that. So I can drill into this and see, for example, okay, well, all of the incoming calls to account service are happening over here. What I can also do, obviously, is do outgoing calls. So let's go back to account controller. We are there, and let me just find the login method. And login over here. This is the guy that I wanted. No, that's not the guy I wanted. There's two logins. So in here, what I can do is, again, inspect this and say outgoing calls. What does this give me? It gives me exactly all of the calls that this method is doing. So I can see both on properties, both on methods that it's calling, what classes it's calling, everything. And then I can qualify this by namespace and class, by project, etc. Okay, and again, I can always do a show preview to show me exactly where this is actually happening. So these two inspectors are really good, are very, very useful, because you have to remember, if you're going to be refactoring a code base, the first thing you need to do is understand the code base. And these inspections are very good to try and understand the flow of the program and how things are working. Let me show you some other stuff, and which are even less known. With this, let's go over to our registration user, and I'm going to navigate over to the shipping address, recipient name, and you can get, again, I invoke the inspect this, and this time I'm going to select value origin. So what does this give me? This shows me where the values are being set. So I can see exactly where this property is being set and how it's being set. And much the same way, I can select the same property and say, show me value destination, which means where it's actually being used. So again, this is very useful. When I want to refactor, I can see, oh, look, that's going to touch a lot of things as soon as I use it. And that's where it reads it, that's where the value is coming from, etc. And last but not least, in terms of impact analysis, let me show you the hierarchy. So hierarchies are available not only for classes, but also for members. If I go to a class, I can select account controller and select hierarchy, and this gives me a nice hierarchy of how that account controller is. So what the base class is, if it's implementing interfaces, etc. And I can do this not only for classes, but also for members. So I can select a member, and it can tell me if it's being overridden, if it's the base, whatever it is. So those are also great to see, kind of like the dependency chain, because again, one of the bad things in legacy code is that we often overuse the inheritance. Okay, so that gives you kind of like a summary of short and fast summary, if you will, of how to do kind of a code smells analysis to find issues in your code, and then actually navigate your code to find where things that you're looking at changing, where it could impact. And again, if you have a unit test, if you have unit tests for your project, then it's much easier because you know exactly what's going to happen. Well, you don't know exactly what's going to happen, but you know that as soon as you change something, if you did it the right way, then that unit test might pass, might break. If you change a hole in your project and all your unit tests are always green, you should be very scared, because that probably means that you're not doing proper unit testing. But normally, when you change things around, normally the unit test breaks, and then you can pinpoint exactly the place, potential thing that you've touched has actually had an impact on. Having said that, again, that's not always the case. That's where tools like code coverage come in great, because code coverage shows you where, for instance, your code hasn't touched, where your unit tests haven't actually code. Code coverage isn't so much about the percentage of coverage that I'm gaining, as it is more about finding potential places in your code where you haven't been able to test and seeing whether it's worth covering those with tests and seeing whether they're high-risk areas of your code. I'm completely against this concept of, oh, in our project we aim for 80% or 90% code coverage. That's not the purpose of code coverage. Code coverage is about detecting potential issues in your code as opposed to a number. Okay, so covering a little bit analysis and impact, let's now move on and show you some stuff in terms of refactoring. Okay, so let me just change projects for a minute. And I'm going to open up my handmade project. There are some questions. Let me see if I can come on to NT. Some of these I'll answer later on because we're going to be seeing them. We're going to be seeing them. We'll see them later on, so I'll get to those. Okay, so obviously one of the typical refactoring that everybody knows is register, right? I'm not going to even cover, register, rename. I'm not even going to cover rename because you all know how to rename things, right? ReSharper do not ever do that. Well, if you do that, you've got to hit Alt-Enter and say apply rename refactoring. I mean, don't manually ever rename stuff, especially in projects where, for instance, like ASP.NET MVC, where you have things that can be used in strings, etc. Use ReSharper for that, and you can press Control-RR about new, and then this renames it, and it looks for the instances in your CSS.html file, and it will rename those in your script files, even if necessary. Here it isn't necessary, but you can see here, for instance, that there, yes, I do want to actually rename it in the action, etc. Okay, so those are basic refactoring. And renaming is very important because renaming, a lot of times the worst thing that we do is name things incorrectly. So I'm always a fan of renaming things. And I often say that you can emerge responsibility of a class, emerge responsibility of a method through how it is called. Because if your method is doing many things, normally you don't have an and in it. So you have to give things appropriate names. And it's very hard to describe something that does many things. So when you try and give it a name, you say, okay, what should I name it? Because it does too many things. That's giving you an indication of, hey, it's doing too many things. Break that thing out chunks. Okay? What I will show you with renaming is, and the reason I renamed this horribly badly is because I call it refactor samples, is because you can actually rename projects and you can rename namespaces without being afraid. If I go to, and I get the properties, I can say a better project name and get this guy and change the default namespace. And as soon as I save that, obviously you all know what happens is that all of these are now going to say that it doesn't match the corresponding namespace. ReSharper, you can just hit Alt-Enter and say move declarations to namespace. But what you can actually also do is go to the Solution Explorer, hit the refactor menu, which is Control-Shift-R, and just say adjust namespaces. And at a global level, that will automatically adjust the namespaces for you for the entire project. So feel free now to rename your project without worrying about anything. And I'll rename the project as well, a better project name, and hope that I don't break too many things while doing that. Okay? So all of this is now renamed. Much the same way you can move things around in folders, etc. So other tiny little refactorings, which I'm not going to show you about, but like introducing a variable, like, you know, I can say, for instance, here, create D and hit Alt-Enter and say, create parameter D, and for instance, a string, and then I can say D+1, and then select that and refactor and say, introduce variable, new D, and those are simple refactorings, okay? So I'm assuming that you're all kind of familiar with those things. So what I want to move on to is a little bit more not so common refactoring. So let me show you a typical pattern, custom repository, customer controller. Here's customer controller, and here's my customer repository, right? So what everybody now knows about dependency injection, everybody knows, right? Raise your hands if you don't. I can't see your hands, so I'm going to assume nobody raised their hands. So you all know about dependency, okay? basically what happens is that this is tightly coupled to the controller, which means that if I want to test this controller right now, it's going to create an instance of my repository, which might talk to my database. It would be even nicer if I named things properly. Repository. There we go. Okay, so it's going to create a customer repository and talk to that. So this tightly couples it to a specific implementation of customer repository. Now, what I'd like to do is actually inject that in, pass that in as a dependency. And the easiest way that I can do this in ReSharper is basically I can just, there's so many ways to do this, but let me just go ahead and delete this new. And as soon as I do that, ReSharper says to me, do you want the initial from the constructor? And I say, of course I do, because I don't want to actually create an instance. I want to pass in that instance. Now, the problem is that this instance being passed in is a specific class. So it doesn't do me much good when I come to change the implementation or where I come to test it. So what I want to do is actually extract an instance. With ReSharper, always, anywhere, from anywhere, you can invoke a refactoring on any class, anything, by just pressing Control-Shift-R. And that gives you a context-sensitive refactoring. I don't have to go to the definition of customer repository to extract an interface. I can do it there and there. So I say extract interface, and I say, yeah, customer repository, and I want all members extracted, and I want to place this in another file, hit next, done. So now I've got a customer repository, an iCustomer repository. In fact, if I go to the navigate menu, I can see space symbol. It shows me the iCustomer repository. Okay? Now let me go back to where I was. I press Control-Shift-Backspace for that. Now, the next step that I want to do is I want to refactor this so that it doesn't use this specific one, but the iCustomer repository. The manual way of doing this, the wrong way, is I come here and I say, this has to be an I, here and say, this has to be an I, and of course, if I'm using this anywhere else, I've got to update that as well. There's actually a refactoring in ReSharper, which is Control-Shift-R, and you say, use base type where possible. Click that, and it selects the iCustomer repository for you, and it does that for you automatically. Okay? So that extract interface and use base type where possible. A lot of people do the extract interface, but they think they have to navigate to the actual code. And not only that, then they go and update everything manually by replacing the customer repository with the actual interface. Let me show you another example. Let's go to airport repository. I did 80,000 miles from January to May to today in airline miles. So I'm obsessed with airports. So here I have an airport repository, and I have a create method, which is name, airport code, city, string, country, etc. So this is horribly wrong, because why? Because what happens is that now if I add another property to my airport type, I've got to pass in another parameter, and really there's a point where passing in parameters to a function becomes too long. So again, I could create a new type and then manually update all of the instances of this, or I could just go to the method and say Control-Shift-R and say extract class from parameters. Say this is, for example, airport information, and I'll say it's its class, it's top level, these are the fields it has, next. And what that does is now create for me an airport information. This doesn't have the ability just yet. I think in ReSharper 8 we already have that to make these auto properties. For now it has to backing fields, but I could just select each of these and convert these to auto properties. And quickly do that. And now notice that what it's done is it's replaced that, and all of the usages has also been replaced. So it's done all of that for me automatically. And obviously anywhere that I'm calling create would also be replaced. And also do here is just hit Alt Enter and say move the file to another type. Or a better approach, which I always use, is Control R over, which is refactored to move to another folder or namespace. And I can say move to folder, and I'll say, for example, model, and it picks up models automatically for me, moves it, and updates all of the namespaces automatically. Okay? So that's how to refactor a method to extract a class from the parameters and shorten the number of parameters. A quick one, which I see so many times in code bases, is people are too lazy to use resource strings. So here I have this as a string, which means that it's going to hard to internationalize. So what I can do is I can just say move to resource, refactor, move to resource, and it's going to say there's no resource file. So what you do, you come here and you say add new item, and we'll say resource file. I'll now go to custom repository, where was it, home controller, and I'll do that again, move to resource. It says this is the value, do you want to add a comment, hit next, and it's moved it to resource. Okay, so again, now you don't have any excuses to not be using resources. Okay, let's move on. We have account controller. This is my favorite. This is the default ASP.NET MVC template even in 4 is really a good example of how not to do things. Okay, so I'm using this as a good example, right? So here is one of my beauties. Let's go down, scroll down, and where do we go? Right at the bottom. Yes, because the best thing to do is use regions. No, I'm lying. Why on earth would you want to use a region? Just put it in another class. Okay, just put it in another class. Name the class appropriately to what it does. Regions are normally just bad. I'm not going to say evil, but they're bad. Here is a funny one. I've got an internal class. Why? Just move that outside, make it a class. Maybe someone else wants to use external logging result. Why are you hiding it in the same file name? But here's one that I want to show you. Now, by default, this method was static. But what I wanted to show you is that sometimes ReSharper says to you, do you want the method static? And I'm not really a big fan of static methods. So what I do is I use this warning from ReSharper to kind of give me this method is in this class. It's not using any instance fields. It's not really, maybe it's giving me a hint that it really doesn't belong in this class. So I kind of use this as a hint instead of to say, yeah, go ahead and make it static. No, what I do is use it as a hint to actually move that to a different file. Having a static method also actually create, make it non-static, and you can also actually create an extension method with that also. But normally what I would do is just move that to its own file with its own class, with its own responsibility. Okay, so let's go over to customers and employees, which is actual file. And you can see here that I have a customer and employee, and I have ID, name, telephone. I'm repeating things basically, right? So I can refactor this and say extract superclass. And on that superclass, I can say name, ID, name, email, telephone, and Twitter, and hit next. And that will now extract the superclass for me. And now I can actually take these guys over here and use customer, although I wouldn't name it customer base. I would probably rename this to person. And then these guys, it just tells me that it's, repeated. So I can just say pull members up. That should do it. And it should recognize it, that it's already there. No, and that screwed it up. So you wouldn't do that. Just eliminate that. I thought that was already there. Okay. So basically that's taking a class and doing the refactoring of creating superclasses from it. And then you can now just take this file over here. Let's locally print it in the Salura, hit refactor, and say move types into matching files, and that will automatically split them up for you and create 3 files and get rid of the original file. Okay? So let's move on. Here's another one I'd like to show you, airport repository. So get airport information. Here's a horrible one. Out parameters, right? So get airport information is a void, but guess what? It's actually going to return 2 values for me. Not nice. You can return 2 tuples. So you can say transform out parameters, refactor this, transform out parameters, select the ones you want, and that will now return a tuple. Now, if you like tuples, go right ahead and do that. I personally am not a big fan of tuples. I think tuples in pairs are fine. Once it gets beyond that, I prefer to kind of create an actual class that basically is a view model or data class or however you want to call it, that just holds information, because I find that way it adds more semantics to the actual code that I'm doing. So that refactoring is that I like to do tuples. Let me show you another refactoring, customer controller, and we're going to go to details. So here I have basically anonymous type. I have customer view model, details view model, get the ID, get the name. And what I could do is, on this new, invoke another refactoring, which is replace anonymous type with name class. So this goes along the lines of, again, maybe adding more semantics or wanting to use that elsewhere. I can just select that and say, I want current method or solution, top level, writable auto properties, even generate the equals hash code, etc., and hit next. And then that will create an anonymous class for me, which is a horrible name to call it. I would actually call that customer details view model, and there you go. So in one click, easily I've refactored anonymous type to use named type. Okay? Now, let me go back before switching over to the ERP store again to cover some other examples. Let me just show you something about the custom patterns. Remember that I showed you before that you could find similar code. We'll take a look at this customer controller. Here we are. Look at this code here. If customer is not null, then do something with that custom. Let's scroll down a little bit. If record is not null, then do something with that record. Let's scroll down a little bit. If customer is not null, then do something. You see that this kind of pattern is repeating itself. Okay. Now, here I'm doing a return view, here I'm doing a return view, etc. So there's already two instances where I'm basically doing the same thing. This, in ASP.NET MVC, for instance, you can actually create a filter and either use an attribute here, create a global attribute to kind of do this using object-oriented programming. What you shouldn't do is use ReSharper to generate boilerplate code for you. Don't do that, because adding the same code over and over again is not a good idea. You know, you have to keep your code dry. So how do I find these kind of patterns? What I can do is go to ReSharper options and click on custom pattern and say add pattern. And I'll say find. And here what I'm going to say is if var equals, or let's say not equals null, then here do some statements, have some statements, and then close this, right? Now, let me go back. And then I'll come to the placeholder and I say extract from pattern. And this automatically identifies what these are. So this is saying basically any expression, and here I can have any number of statements. And I would write a description here and say, consider using AOP for this. And then I can say, for example, show this as a hint. As soon as I add this pattern, so this is again the ability to ReSharper with custom patterns, what happens is that now I get a highlighting here saying consider using AOP for this. And I can take this one step further and actually do a refactoring by doing the replace, only a find but a replace. Let me show you that with some custom patterns that we've created before, so I'll import these. So you can see, for instance, this is easy to understand. I can say every time you find this pattern, which is basically a try statement, find the var dispose, consider replacing it with a use, with a using. And I can then hit Alt-Enter. When it finds this, I can hit Alt-Enter and replace this immediately. But what's even more powerful is that I can select a pattern and say, for instance, search now. And then it was that pattern in the entire solution, and I can even replace it globally. So for this search now, see that it's found this pattern being used often. And it doesn't matter the actual type or the name of the variable. It's a very powerful way to actually extend ReSharper with your own patterns to do code smell detection. Okay? So let me just switch back over to the other solution again. And there's a couple more things that I want to show you quickly. Fortunately, I don't have time to actually go through everything that I would like to, but there's about it, but I'm going to get some of the important ones in. One of the important ones is, let me show you the crypto service class. Crypto. If it will load. There we go. So here's a crypto service, and if you look at the methods I have, encrypt account information, decrypt account information, encrypt order information, encrypting all these different things. And then at the bottom, I have a method wrapped in a region. Let me find it, which is helpers. Guess what's the deal with the helpers? So you know what I'm going to do? This belongs in its own class. It doesn't belong in the region. So I'm going to select this guy, and I'm going to select the decrypt over here. I'm going to select these guys, which I could have done in a faster way. Hit refactor, and see at the bottom it says extract class. And this brings up a little dialog box. And it says to me, yeah, do you want to extract this class? And I say, yes, I want to extract these two methods. And it says, well, these two methods are being used by these classes, and it says that this method is unavailable because it's using a private property. So do you want to make it public? Do you want to create a public? What do you want to do? And I'm just going to say this is the actual crypto class. And I'll give it a nicer name and hit next. What we'll do is actually extract that class into its own class. So you see it's gotten rid of the service. And now it's referencing that class as a property. So I have the actual crypto class. So now everywhere where it was using that class, it's actually now referencing the private field. Sorry, where it was using those methods, it's now referencing the private field. So this is a very powerful way to actually start applying single responsibility to your different classes, which is basically identifying methods that don't belong in that class and having ReSharper extract the classes out and creating own classes for it. Okay? And quickly, let me just show you something with crawl content. Crawl a service. Here, again, I can, for instance, take this method, much the same way. This is a very typical one that I'm sure you're all familiar with, but I can select a method, a bunch of lines, and say refactor method, and then that will extract the method for me. Much the same way, which I'm not sure if many people are aware, that you can come to the actual method call and say, make it inline, and create that as an inline. So what that will do is actually take that code and place it inline. Okay? So those are kind of some of the more unknown or less frequently known refactorings that I've kind of found that people aren't too familiar with ReSharper. I haven't managed to look through all of the different refactorings that we do offer, just as I said, a bunch of them, and I'm hoping that you picked up something new in terms of those. We are running out of time. I think we've got about 3 or 4 minutes. There are some questions. Let me just switch over to the deck over here. So I'll bring this up. This is a book that I recommend. It's by Michael Feathers. It's Working Effectively with Legacy Code. So while I've shown you actually in this webinar how to impact analysis, how to detect code smells, how to do refactoring, here it shows you patterns of how to do some of those refactorings. It speaks about that. It tells you how to deal with unit testing, how to test legacy code, etc. Very good book that I highly recommend that you read if you haven't yet. Okay, let me see if I can get through questions over here. Let's just go through that. Dawn, I think we're still a little bit good on time. We've got a couple of minutes left. Okay, so there is an example. I could write one unit test. Unfortunately, I don't have time to do that. But you can ping me or I can blog about it. If you give me specifics of what type of unit testing you will want to, I can do that. The question is, with ReSharper inspection features, can it find things like incoming calls or general use of code from JavaScript? We do have support for JavaScript, but we don't have it in terms of What you can find usages if it is specific strings that it's searching for. But we also do have find usages for JavaScript code. Yes. Can you show how to solve the if not set get default value and aspect? Yes, I can. If you ping me with that, Steve, I can show you some ways to do that. And it kind of depends on the project that you're working with, the framework that you're working with. Okay, Greg, I post the location to the GitHub. So that is http github.com/hhariri, and then the repository is called Clean Code, I think. You go to hhariri on my GitHub and then find it there. Can ReSharper find issues at the system level? For example, finding code that was legal and fine for an older version of Windows, but which may not be which may be dangerous with current Windows version. Not really, but you can do some patterns in principle. It shouldn't be a problem. Is there a way to create custom inspections to identify methods with one or three parameters? Yep, you could probably do that with custom patterns. And also, as I showed you, take a look at my Clean Code plugin. You can see that you can apply the same thing basically to methods as opposed to only constructors. Doug asks, what was the name of the plugin you used? Clean Code. It's on GitHub, as I mentioned. And can I download ReSharper file with code small patterns? Yes, if you go to the documentation of our website, you'll be able to download those patterns that I showed you on the jetbrains.com/ReSharper, and then click on documentation. And what was the command again to extract a class? That is Control-Shift-R, and then there's a refactoring, which is called extract. And do you have custom patterns stored anyway? Yes, those are on our website. Okay, so with that, I think we're out of time. Let me just bring up my slide with my details. If I haven't managed to get to your questions, or if you do have any questions later, please feel free to email me. Once again, my email is hadi@jetbrains.com, and you can reach me on Twitter at @hhariri. And thank you very much for attending, and I hope that you enjoyed it. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. This concludes today's Academy Live session. Again, materials from the presentation will be available at http://Academy on this session's webpage for Microsoft employees and partners and customers. You can access the webcast recording via the Worldwide Events Center, all within approximately 48 hours. Also, again, if you'd like a copy of the presentation deck that also has Hadi's contact information and the book that he was recommending, please go to the handout section in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, the icon that looks like 3 little pieces of paper, and go ahead and download that. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to our presenter, and thank you, audience, for logging in and joining us today.